I'm Alfredo, and I'm with May 1st People Inc., and we're talking about Marxism. We covered one idea that I feel is fundamental to it, Gutenswesen, species essence, that we produce our own means of subsistence. And now we get to the second idea. Back in 69 or something, I was about finishing up college. I think it was in the third year of college. And I used to work during the summers because I had to work my way through to pay for college. But on the days I got off, I would go to the library. And the reason why I would go to the library is because I'm a reformed gangster and ex-criminal, ex-offender. And so to stay out of trouble, which for some reason I was always getting in when I was in the streets, I would try to stay off the streets. And, I wouldn't get into trouble when I was in school. I was already a community activist, so I was pretty straight then. But I would go to the library for 2 or 3 hours and read. We had just moved to 173rd Street in the Bronx, and I could walk close to the. We didn't live. We lived in the black and Puerto Rican area, but I could walk over to the Jewish area. We played basketball with a lot of the Jewish guys, and the library was in the Jewish area, and I could walk in there, and I'd go to the bottom floor of the library, and I would read books from the reference library, and that's where I read Hemingway and Steinbeck and philosophers, everybody I read. I just really enjoyed myself reading. One day I grabbed this book by these guys named Marx and Engels. Now, the book that I first read wasn't published during the period we're talking about for the most part. It was published in 1848. What had happened was Carl and Fred, who were always pursuing these revolutionary ideas and these organizing revolutions, had been meeting with a bunch of people. They were in various parts of the world, partly in England, where you remember Fred was in England to do his British working class thing, so he knew some of these people. And he took Carl over there and introduced them. These were people affiliated with an organization called the League of the Just. The League of the Just was a Fabian socialist organization. They believed that socialism would occur because of the logic, intelligence, and good-heartedness of the human race. They were also very Christian. Believed in one society of equality in the eyes of God. And that was the League of the Just. And Carl and Fred didn't belong to those guys. Carl and Fred had their own small little collective called the Communist Correspondence Committees. Committees of Correspondence. The Communist Correspondence Committees. And they knew each other, and Carl and Fred saw that the League was involved in strikes and other kinds of stuff, but was underground. It wasn't a public organization. So these guys approached the League people. Remember, these guys are in their early 20s. They approached the League leadership and say, well, look, guys, your work is great and everything like that, but you're not going to make a revolution unless you go public. Can't do it. And the League asked Carl and Fred to join them, and after several splits, remember this is a left-wing organization, so you're going to have a lot of splits. It's automatic. But the group that stayed inside the League then invited these guys to join them and form a public organization. And the public organization they formed was called the Communist League. And they commissioned Carl and Fred to write a pamphlet laying out their ideas. And they did. It was published in 1848. That was the little book I pulled. It was originally called the Manifesto of the Communist Party. But in a very short time, it took on its nickname, for which it's today known, the Communist Manifesto. As I was reading it, I read the first section. There's a preface. And the preface says, "There's a specter haunting Europe." The specter of communism. Now look, a Puerto Rican ex-gangster living in the Bronx in his late teens. How am I not going to be impressed with something like that, right? The specter haunting, I just loved it. I said, this is so cool, I got to keep reading this stuff. So I read up to read through the introduction, then I get to the first chapter. And the first chapter has a stunning statement. It says, the history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggle. The hell does that mean? Now, I knew something about class struggle because I was already in college, right? I would go to class. It was so painfully boring that I had to struggle to stay awake. But I even knew at that point that's not what these guys were talking about when they talked about class struggle. Matter of fact, while I didn't understand the concept of class struggle, it touched a nerve somehow. I got a feeling. And so I read the whole of the Communist Manifesto, and from then on, I began studying Marx. Class struggle. That's the second idea. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels do write a lot of material about pre-capitalist societies. But when they talk about pre-capitalist societies, they tell you more about what they're not than what they are. They don't spend a lot of time analyzing those societies because that's not the society where they're going to make the revolution that they want. So they don't really focus on that heavy duty. But you can still kind of trace the development of classes. And without going into too much detail, most of the history of the human race has been taken up with societies that were extremely simple, primitive in nature. Small clans, small families, small villages, in which, for the most part, people were equal and equally shared the products of their labor. That lasted for most of human history, tens of thousands of years. A stage of human development Marx calls primitive communism. But that starts to change. As we go on, certain groups of people in these societies have certain tasks. Some people become better at making tools. Some become better at storing. Some become better at cooking things. Some become better at gathering. Some people, usually the elders who have more experience, become better at leading and making decisions. And the decisions are frequently left to them. As we come closer to contemporary society, get into more modern society, let's say the last 5,000-6,000 years, we see that these groups have congealed, have frozen into groups with genuine power. No longer is production distributed based on the scarcity of the production, but now the relative scarcity of production, which, by the way, is starting to fade. More and more stuff is available as you get into the imperial societies in Greece and Rome and the various other feudal and slave-owning societies. Those groups amass power so that you have, in many societies, a royalty, nobility, merchant class, landowner, many, many strata of the society. And the greatest number of people, of course, are the people who work. Serfs, peasants, slaves. Throughout most of human history, there were no classes to speak of. but the most recent history. They hitherto existing societies that Fred and Carl were referring to, the classes are very real. And in capitalism, these classes become smaller, more concentrated, and fewer. To the point that, whereas in society 3,000 years ago, there were many strata, in capitalism there are only two classes of note. The bourgeoisie or capitalist class, and the working class in industrial society, the proletariat. What are these classes? Marxism holds that social classes are defined by three attributes. First of all, it's a group of people who have a common relationship to the means of production. Remember, production is subsistence? Means of subsistence? Means of production in capitalism. That's the system that produces the stuff. Capitalists, the bourgeoisie, own the means of production. That's their common relationship. The working class doesn't. That's its common relationship to the means of production. It works at the means of production, but it got no ownership at all, no control, nothing. Now, people see that and say, hey, that's really great, but that does not define the society. The society is much more complicated than that. Moreover, yeah, this produces a kind of clash between these classes, but it doesn't come close to defining and explaining all the different social clashes and struggles that we see in contemporary society. Marx falls short. Well, yeah, now he falls short if you stop at that one attribute. But he didn't. Now, Marx said there were three attributes that a class has. Number one, it has to have that common relationship. Number two, it's got to be conscious of that relationship. You want to test it? Try to take away the means of production from a capitalist and see how clearly that capitalist understands his relationship to the means of production. They will come down on you like a wall of bricks. That's because the third attribute, the class acts on its relationship to the means of production and the consciousness that it has about that relationship. Acts on it. This is a complex and nuanced point, this third point. That's why I think a lot of people don't dwell on it. All that the capitalist society is made up of, is comprised of, all of it is generated by this particular set of relationships between classes. It's framed by that. So government, the state, ideology, culture, all of this is generated by this relationship between the classes. On the one hand, the bourgeoisie seeking to protect and defend its control of the means of production. On the other hand, the working class fighting back against that through the attempt to raise wages and all this other stuff. All these clashes that are constantly taking place. And the society forms. This does not mean that capitalism develops on the 31st of March or something, and the capitalist class on the 1st of April immediately begins constructing the society. It's not the way it works, man. These are gradual developments, they're organic developments, and they are in constant flux. They're dialectical, just like nature, just like human life. Dialectical. Things going back and forth and clashing and moving back and forth. They're not straight or uniform. But they do go in a direction, and the direction is the defense by each class, or the defense by the ruling class of its privilege, and the challenge by the working class to the ruling class's privilege. That's where government, law, and all the rest comes out. That's where oppressions come out. Once these institutions are established, they themselves affect the lives of working people. So that it's not that the class clash alone affects the lives of working people. That's not what Marx held. That's a frequent distortion of Marxist thinking. It's an economistic vision of society. All of these things, these institutions created by this class conflict and emanating from this class conflict, all of them affect people and affect our lives in fundamental ways, in very real ways. But the important thing to remember is that these classes are the motor for all of this. Without classes, these things would be very, very different. Without classes, you wouldn't need a state. Without classes, governance and democracy would be totally different. So would culture. So would ideology. It would all change. And that's why these classes are in struggle. A very good question. Why? Why in the hell can't we just live together? Let the capitalists have their ownership. We do our work. What the hell? Everybody lives happily ever after. You don't need much to live, etc. Just everybody get along, and a lot of craziness, always fighting with each other. I can't understand this. What is it that brings these classes into this class struggle? Value. The third concept. Let me save. Be right back.